pre-European, worked as an army unit, much in a modern sense, the legions. So the soldiers all depended on each other. They had heavy shields. They carried two types of spears. One was a casting spear and one was a punching spear. But their primary weapon was the shield and the gladius. Gladius was a very short sword with a very sharp point. It was used as a hack and punch weapon. But in that time frame, you had another guy 2 inches to your right, and he had another guy 2 inches to the right. So basically, it was kind of like the teeth in a Shrek, quite literally. And that's how they beat down the bad guys, or their enemies. Later on, the Northern Europeans were not nearly so organized. The Gauls, the Picts, the Celts. So they went in for different types of weapons. Primarily, they used axes and clubs, and an early sword compared to most European swords. They were all slash and hack weapons. They did not use the point. The Viking swords, if you see them, I don't have one here, but the Viking swords, if you saw them, were almost rounded on the ends. They were long edges and rounded on the edge, kind of like a double-sided butter knife. They had almost no guard because you never expected to have anything coming down the blade towards you. They're always doing this routine. And they almost always had a 3 or 5 lobe little crown-shaped pommel, flat on one end and then rounded to the other. That was their sword, and like I said, they were exclusively hack and chop weapons. The other one was their axe. This is an example of about a 10th or 11th century axe. It's called a bearded axe because of the long, and it's got two purposes. Number one, it's a very thin blade compared to what we would consider like a woods axe or something like that, because it wasn't designed to chop wood, it was designed to chop people. The other thing is by cutting out, they wanted to have a nice long cutting surface, of course. It gives you more weapon to use. But you build an iron, and keep in mind they used iron and low-grain iron with that rather than a high-grade steel. It got very, very heavy. So what they did was they designed something like this, had a very long blade but a relatively shallow attach point. That lightened the weapon, but it still gave you the same amount of combat edge. The other thing that this did was allowed you to have two hands where you could actually punch with it. And you notice the pressure of the punch is directly behind the center of the blade.
Right.
You couldn't do that with, you couldn't punch like that, but down here, you've got that. So that gave them a tremendous amount of extra pressure and use with this.
Right.
Comparing that, since we're only going to talk a little bit about axes, let's compare that to a much later axe. This is about a 14th or 15th century Italian axe. You'll notice that the blade is much smaller, much more rounded. The reason for this is because the Vikings were going against people using at best leather armor, or maybe some leather jerkins with some metal discs sewn to them for armor. So you didn't need to have the penetration power. This axe with this extremely rounded point gives you a much more concentrated point of impact. So that gives you a better cut. And at the same time, they've added the rear and top spikes in order to punch through armor. This was used after plate armor became much more prevalent, and was basically for getting into the small tight spots. Because by the time plate mail became mature, most hand weapons were relatively ineffectual against them. Okay, the next sword we got. This is a 12th century Scottish sword. It's a replica of an effigy sword that was on a tomb. You'll notice it's in some ways similar to what I described with the short swords of the Vikings. It's a long, straight, parallel side mostly, but it has a little bit of a point. Not much, but a little bit of a point. Viking sword would be even more rounded than this. It's got a long groove down the center. It's called some people call them blood grooves. The technical term is fuller. And fullers actually weren't for letting blood out. They were to lighten the sword. It's kind of like cutting out holes in the sides of a bridge and making a truss. It lightened the blade without weakening the strength of it. In this case, it doesn't particularly need stiffening because, again, this is an early piece. This would have gone against light chainmail plate wasn't really in vogue by that point, or was starting to come in. What plate there was fairly lightweight. So this would have been effective against them. The Quillians, the sides of the guard are called Quillians. This is a standard Scottish style with the down-drooped Quillians, or up-drooped, depending on how you're holding it, and a very large, round, heavy pommel to give it balance. This is a fairly well-balanced sword. Balance point is right about, not even, it's just down from the grip. This means it was a quick sword. It was easy to spin around and maneuver with. It wasn't all that great at chopping at things, but it was there. In Scottish swords, in Irish swords, which you will find frequently, is a straight crossbar and rings at the ends of it. Not holes, but big metal rings attached to the tips, and a big metal ring for a pommel. That's a sure sign of an Irish sword. This is a fairly certain sign of a Scottish sword. And again, this is 12th century.
Why are the Quillians going upward and not out to the side like so many other swords I've seen?
Well, it's number one, it's a stylistic thing. Like I said, it's something that was particular to the Scots. But the other reason is this allows you to trap a blade better. When a blade comes down this and hits the bottom, it can't slide back out. On a completely squared off blade, it would be much easier for the other guy to get his sword loose. And this was largely for sword-to-sword type of combat. So, in those things, you wanted to trap the other guy's blade, grab it, twist it, pull it out of his hands, whatever. It was just, and you can see that a little bit in this later one. This sword is a 14th or 15th century sword, something like Henry V might have carried. You'll notice two things about it. There's not a fuller on this. There is a ridge on it. It serves the same purpose, that this area that's cut out on either side gives you a lightening of the material without weakening it. But at the same time, this ridge makes this much more rigid. It doesn't flex as much, which makes it a much more effective punching weapon. And if you'll see, the tip is much, much sharper than the others. It tapers a good deal, not parallel, but taper. And it has a very fine point. And this was designed for getting through chainmail, breaking through mail, and for seeking out the weak spots in plate armor, up under the pauldrons and behind the greaves, and in places where the leather lashing was, if you could get to it with a small enough item and punch through to get to the flesh underneath. Again, the edge itself, with the central ridge, the entire edge is much thinner, and it gives you a better chopping, much better cutting edge as well. While the tip, the cutouts stop right here on either side, so the tip is very massive and reinforced for punching through things.
So the ridge gives it structural strength to
keep it from flexing as you punch in. You don't want to punch in and have your blade bend around.
Right.
So this, as you punch in, it keeps it stiff.
It's like it's almost like as if it was you took a board and attached it to it to give it extra strength.
Yeah. Or you laid an iron rod down it to give it some extra strength. But at the same time, if you made the whole thing that thick, the edges would have been worthless. Yeah. So it's cut out on either side to give you still a good hacking and chopping edge.
I see.
So that's kind of the evolution of the broadswords. Now, when plate mail really became big, there was a short-lived, and these, everybody sees these in the movies, but these really weren't around all that long. And this is a two-hander. And it's built, you'll notice, quite a bit like the old Scottish sword. It's got not much of a tip, because these things were for wailing around, swinging around, and bashing people with. It was not made for punching through stuff. Hello, Jenny.
Hello, Sam.
We're doing some drum for a lot of swing. The trouble with these is they were only good in single combat, because you couldn't get in a melee with this because somebody'd sneak up behind you and stab you while you were trying to swing it at somebody else.
Right.
Because they're very slow. They're too heavy, too massive. But in the old jousting one-on-one days, this was popular for about 100 years, and then they faded out.
All right, then. May I ask you a question?